Martin, here we are on a drizzly and wet day in Suffolk.
For Sunday, it's the Feast of Christ the King, and the Gospel reading is Luke's account of Jesus on the cross, which has as the sort of one of the main dimensions of which is the dialogue with the two thieves.
Yeah, the two thieves with Jesus on the cross. That's mentioned in a number of Gospels, not the dialogue, but certainly the fact that he was crucified between two other thieves. It's mentioned in Mark and in John, I think Matthew as well.
Yeah. But it's Luke that gives us this
the actual dialogue. Yeah.
And one of the interesting things about that dialogue is that I think it's the only example, actually, as it were, in the scene where two people are talking about Jesus with him present. So they're kind of talking over his head, as it were, which is a kind of curious thing. But I mean, it perhaps get close to it in the road to Emmaus, but they stop talking about Jesus when Jesus joins them. Of course, they don't realise who has joined them. So I just wanted to pick up, in relation to Christ the King, therefore reflecting on Jesus' identity as King, Jesus' kingship. And I noticed in one of the commentaries that I was looking at, they made a fleeting reference to a little bit of parallel with the three temptations. So when Jesus is tempted at the very beginning of his ministry, and what you've got there is a not dissimilar refrain where Satan says, if you're the Son of God, why don't you do this? Why don't you turn these stones into bread? Why don't you submit to me and become Lord of all these dominions? Why don't you throw yourself off the pinnacle of the temple? And in that, we characteristically reflect on that as Jesus wrestling with his identity, wrestling with his vocation, and resisting the temptation to be other than that whom he is called to be. But interestingly, it's demonstrated in the scene, but it's not actively demonstrated. He doesn't do something except resist. He doesn't do something that demonstrates what it means to be the Son of God in that scene. So then if you then jump fast forward to the crucifixion, where, of course, we've seen a huge amount of Jesus in teaching, in healing, in miracles, in his engagement with disciples, in his engagement with the religious leadership, a huge amount of what it means to be the Son of God. And then we have this denouement, and the same questions arise. If you're the Son of God, if you're the King of the Jews, and you've got three. You've got the crowds jeer, the soldiers mock, and the unrepentant thief taunts. So you've got the same sort of, there's a kind of little bit of a parallelism there, saying, if you're really this person, if you're really the King of the Jews, if you're really the Son of God, then you'll save yourself and us.
Yeah.
And which, of course, is precisely what he's doing. But they don't get that, and it's the sort of, if you like, the fulfillment of who he's become, having set out on that journey following the temptations of the devil. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I'm just
yeah, it
struck
does.
by that parallelism.
Yeah, no, it's yeah, really intriguing parallel. It's interesting, isn't it? Christ the King, the Feast of Christ the King, it focuses on Jesus' passion and his death. And whatever else this is saying you need to understand that this is a kingship that's very different. Because Satan has tempted him, as you say in the Temptations, with versions of kingship, satisfying your appetites and ruling over others authoritatively in ways which Jesus resists. And if there is any glory in Jesus' kingship, it is a very strange kind of glory. It is a glory that involves sacrifice, a glory that involves forgiving your enemies, it involves a self-giving love unto death. And Augustine talks about this, doesn't he? He talks about the kingship of Jesus as being a kingship that's reflected by us in his church's day in martyrdom.
Yeah.
In that, death is at the centre of this kind of kingship. And it's at the centre because it shows up how the kings of this world can be so tyrannically running their kingdom on the basis of our fear of death. Whereas Jesus is willing to go to death and go through death in order to draw us into his kingdom. And it always makes me think, when I think on Christ the King, I think of Shunro Suzuki, who was a Buddhist, but he was talking to an eager student, and he said, "Don't be so keen for enlightenment. From where you're standing, it's not that attractive." And I sometimes think that about the kingdom of God, that, from where a lot of us are standing, the kingdom of God isn't that attractive, because it's a kingdom that is about dying and rising with Jesus. And that's a very, very different kind of glory from the glory we find in the world. There's quite a lot of pushback, isn't there, or has been over the last 30, 40 years against the word king and kingdom, hasn't there? And, people prefer reign or realm or another term. But archetypally, it's massive in the human psyche, And if you just look at popular films, or Lion King, or The Return of the King, or Game of Thrones, kingship and who is in authority for us and who rules for us is a live issue. And I don't think we can, push it away by simply changing the language or arguing that, it's all egalitarian and there's nobody ruling over us. Because some things and some people do rule in our lives willy-nilly. They do have authority for us.
So I mean, going back to your point about it's a very different sort of a kingship, and I know this is the obvious point, but it's the seeds are sown in the Temptations when Jesus says, "No, I'm not going to take this shortcut. No, I'm not going to rule like that." And what you see ultimately on the cross, and what you see ultimately in death, is the complete letting go. And what does it mean to be a king who completely lets go of the need to control, indeed the need to live, for the sake of the flourishing of creation? And it's that paradox that we inhabit, and so it's a constant challenge to us as Christians to say, are we letting go? What are the little deaths that we are actually doing in our ministry, in our lives, where we aren't trying to impose our will, where we aren't trying to force the result, where we aren't trying to control other people, but where we take that incredible risk, because we're all afraid. Oh, they'll never get it right if we don't. We're all afraid of that, but actually Jesus is saying, that's what I want you to do, and trust in the power of the resurrection.
Yeah, and your words earlier about the irony of it is writ large. Originally, the people of God, Samuel tries to dissuade him. It's not a good idea having a king, it really isn't. But of course, they went down the route of having a king. But then God works with that with King David and says, "I will be faithful to your line." And the irony is, God is faithful to the line of David as it culminates in Jesus, with Jesus' death of all things, with the death of the King, which is life for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.